In this video, we're going to look at how the nervous system and the endocrine system, so hormones, regulate the digestive process and our appetite. When we eat a meal, we are going to absorb everything from that meal. Digestion is not regulated by what your body needs. It would be awesome if it would, right? So then we could eat whatever we want and only absorb what we need. But what happens is we absorb everything from that meal, and then we will store it in our liver, our adipose tissue where our fat cells are, or in the muscles as glycogen, and we will store nutrients to use later. If we continually eat more than we need, we will continually store those extra nutrients. Now, the digestive system is regulated by the nervous system. So in our brain, we have a region called the hypothalamus. That is our major control center for eating. We have a hunger center and we have a satiety center. Satiety means that you feel full. So our hypothalamus will signal our autonomic nervous system, whether we're hungry or whether we're feeling full. The autonomic nervous system, the parasympathetic division, is what controls our digestive processes. So the parasympathetic neurons will innervate or interact with neurons in the enteric nervous system. So the enteric nervous system means the neurons that surround the digestive tract. The hypothalamus can also trigger behavioral responses. So, for example, if you're hungry, then your hypothalamus will produce dopamine that will make you motivated to go and find food. Now, when we look at the enteric nervous system, let's just have a quick reminder of the neuron networks that surround the digestive tract. In a previous video, we looked at the different layers of the digestive tract. So let's just focus here is the lumen. This is where our food particles are being chemically and physically broken down and digested. And then surrounding this inner layer, we have our submucosa. This network of neurons is called the submucosal plexus. A plexus just means a network of neurons in the peripheral nervous system. And these control secretions. So the secretions are going to be different hormones. It is also going to be enzymes and mucus and hydrochloric acid and all of the different secretions that are required to help us digest our food in the lumen. Now, the other plexus is the myenteric plexus, and this is what is going to be controlling the muscle contractions. The muscles have to be able to contract to move food back and forth within the digestive tract to help physical digestion, and also peristalsis to move the food through the digestive tract in one direction. So the nervous system, the enteric nervous system, can be triggered by the hypothalamus, the autonomic nervous system, and it can actually also be triggered directly by what is happening in the digestive tract. So when we swallow food and it physically touches the walls of the digestive tract, like in our stomach, that is also going to trigger those enteric neurons to start secretions and to start muscle contractions. And then we also have hormonal control. So I have a chart for you. We're going to look at a bunch of different hormones that have different ways of regulating the digestive process. When we look at the digestive process, we can break it down into 3 phases. First, we have our cephalic phase, which means that we can initiate our digestive processes, secretions and muscle contractions, with our brain, with thinking. So we can think about food, see food, like commercials are very good at triggering your cephalic response, smelling food or tasting food. So nothing is actually even in your digestive tract yet, but you will start the digestive processes. So our brain likes to anticipate lots of different things so that it can be prepared, and one of those things is digestion. So when you start to think about food, or if you eat at the same time every day and you have a good circadian rhythm, your brain will anticipate and start the digestive processes before you even begin. So that control is all about neural control that starts in your brain. The second phase is called the gastric phase, and this is when we are actually eating a meal and food is being chewed up and entering the stomach. Then we are going to start muscle contractions in the stomach and secretions in the stomach, such as hydrochloric acid and pepsinogen. Then the food is going to start moving into the small intestine, and that triggers the third phase called the intestinal phase. And this is when we complete the chemical digestion of food, and then we start to absorb nutrients into the bloodstream. The gastric phase and the intestinal phase are regulated by neural and endocrine mechanisms, whereas the cephalic phase is mostly neural. Now, let's just have a look at a gastric gland in the stomach. Up here, this is the lumen of the stomach. This is where your food particles are being physically broken down. So the stomach muscles are contracting, your food is turning into chyme and mixing with all of the gastric secretions and being physically broken down into smaller bits. Now, the lining is epithelial cells, simple columnar epithelial cells. When we look at these surface epithelial cells, most of these are going to be regular epithelial cells, or they can be goblet cells. And remember that goblet cells produce mucus, so they are located near the surface so that the mucus can help protect the lining of the stomach. Then we have this region called the gastric pit, and then down in the very bottom part we have the gastric gland. Now this is not an endocrine gland, but it does contain endocrine cells. So this gland is an exocrine gland because it is secreting substances into the lumen of a hollow organ. So that makes this an exocrine gland. The exocrine secretions are going to be things like intrinsic factor and hydrochloric acid, and also pepsinogen, which will, on activation with hydrochloric acid, become pepsin that helps us to digest protein. Now, the enteroendocrine cells are going to produce a hormone. This hormone is called gastrin, and we will look at what the different kinds of hormones are. So gastrin is one of them, but the one that I actually want to talk about first is called serotonin. And you may have heard of serotonin before. It is a hormone that is known to play a really significant role in our mood. So our brain produces about 5% of the serotonin that is in our body, and about 95% of our serotonin is actually produced in the digestive tract. So it plays a role directly with digestion, but it also plays a role with mood. And so you can see that eating food can be associated with feeling good. And this is why some people have comfort food. So when you have stress, you want to feel good, your brain wants you to have serotonin, then sometimes we can connect comfort foods with feeling good. So one of the food molecules that are particularly triggering for serotonin is carbohydrates. So when we eat carbohydrates like starches, like potatoes or potato chips, or cake or cookies or pasta, those are complex carbohydrates that break down into glucose. When we start absorbing glucose, we start making serotonin. Also interesting, our gut bacteria, the normal flora microorganisms that live in our large intestine, they also make serotonin. So to have more serotonin, having healthy gut bacteria is a step in the right direction. So eating probiotic foods, eating lots of fiber to feed your healthy gut bacteria so that they can stay healthy. Or you can also take a probiotic supplement. So having healthy gut bacteria contributes to a good mood, partly because of the effects on serotonin. Now, serotonin, how does it directly affect the digestive tract? It starts to slow down the digestive process. So serotonin is produced when we start absorbing nutrients in the intestinal phase. And then once we start absorbing nutrients, we need to slow the process down. So it will inhibit gastric secretions because food has now moved from the stomach into the small intestine. So now we slow down the digestive processes happening in the stomach because the food has moved on. And then serotonin will also increase peristalsis, the muscle contractions, for the whole rest of the way of the digestive tract. And then it also helps to dilate blood vessels in the intestinal region. We need to have dilated blood vessels so that there's lots of ways for the nutrients to absorb into our bloodstream. So we want to have lots of blood flow to the digestive tract during our digestive process. Next, I want to talk about the hormone gastrin. Gastrin is made in the stomach cells, those endocrine cells that I just showed you in the gastric pit. Now, for each of the hormones that I'm going to talk about, I want you to think about where they're made, What causes them to be made? What's the stimulus for their production? And then what is their function? Why do we make them? With gastrin, that is produced, where is it made? In the stomach cells, those endocrine cells in the stomach. And it is produced when there is physical contact of food with the stomach lining. So once we physically start swallowing food, we're going to make gastrin. We are also going to trigger gastrin with our nervous system, those enteric, the submucosal plexus that triggers secretions. And then what does gastrin do? Gastrin stimulates the secretion of hydrochloric acid and pepsinogen so that we can start to digest our food in the stomach. The next hormone is called cholecystokinin, or CCK for short. Cholecystokinin is produced in the small intestine. And this occurs, the stimulus is when our chyme starts moving from the stomach into the small intestine. Now, any chyme at all will trigger some cholecystokinin to be released, but primarily when fat is part of the chyme. So when we eat healthy fats, not bad fats, and that is part of our meal, that will help increase the stimulus of cholecystokinin. Now, what that hormone does is it triggers the gallbladder to contract, which releases bile into the small intestine, and we need bile for breaking down fat. It also plays a role in stimulating the pancreas to release digestive enzymes because the pancreas produces an enzyme called lipase, and that enzyme is required for chemically breaking down fats, whereas the bile physically breaks big droplets into small droplets. The next hormone is called secretin. Secretin is also made by the small intestine. It's going to be stimulated when chyme moves from the stomach into the small intestine. But now the stimulus is slightly different. Now, remember that the stomach makes hydrochloric acid. And then when that acidic chyme comes into the small intestine, we need to neutralize that. So that acid has to be neutralized with bicarbonate that is made by the pancreas. So when acid enters the small intestine will produce secretin. That is going to trigger the pancreas. Then, so the function is the pancreas is going to release bicarbonate into the small intestine to neutralize the acid, and it will also release more digestive enzymes that will help the whole process in the small intestine. The next one is called GIP, or it has actually two names, so glucose-dependent insulinotropic peptide, or it can also be called gastric inhibitory peptide. So GIP is also produced in the small intestine. Now, GIP is produced in the small intestine when glucose starts to be absorbed into the bloodstream. Now, as we start absorbing nutrients, now the body has to be able to deal with those nutrients. We can't just flood the whole bloodstream. So remember from a previous video, the blood flow is going to go from the digestive tract directly to the liver, and the liver is going to start sorting nutrients. Well, one of the ways that your liver and your other cells deals with glucose is with the hormone insulin. So GIP is a hormone that is produced when blood sugar starts to increase to signal the pancreas to make insulin. Now our blood sugar and our nutrients can be dealt with in the bloodstream. And then I want to also mention a hormone called somatostatin. This is also produced in the small intestine, but it has more of an inhibitory role. So as our digestive process is moving on, food is moved from the stomach into the small intestine, somatostatin is going to start slowing down that process. It's going to inhibit the gastric secretions, just like serotonin does. It allows the rest of the digestion to occur at a slow rate so that we can absorb all of our nutrients. That makes absorption very effective so that we're not just excreting a whole bunch of nutrients. Okay, now your digestive system isn't always 100% perfect. Sometimes we don't absorb everything, and you may even sometimes see undigested food molecules, right? So sometimes if that whole digestive process goes too quickly, we won't absorb everything. But for the most part, in healthy people, we generally absorb pretty much everything that we consume. Now, I have a summary chart. I have two summary charts at the end. One will be for those hormones that we just discussed that regulate the process of digestion, where it's made, why it's made, and what it does. And then I also have another chart about appetite. So let's just look at how do we control our appetite. There are a bunch of different factors that can be involved, but a few things that I want to point out. Number one is the nutrient status of our body. So if we have low blood sugar, for example, have you heard the term hangry? Right? So when your blood sugar gets too low and it's not stable, we will start to produce hormones that increase that, but there's always a little period of time between low blood sugar and by the time the hormone production can start to adjust that. So you can have these little periods of time when your blood sugar is too low, and that will stimulate the hypothalamus to drive behavioral activities like going to find food, and it will start the digestive process, making you feel like your stomach is growling. There's another hormone that's involved in that. So when our blood sugar is low, it is going to stimulate the hypothalamus because your brain thinks, oh no, we're running out of nutrients. Okay? It's easier for your brain to make you eat food to increase your blood sugar than it is to go and produce all the hormones, to go to the fat cells, break down the fat, and do all of that chemical work, right? So your brain is always going to try to make you eat first because it's easier. But if you know that you don't need to eat, your body is just reacting, you can just wait a little while and then the hormones will kick in, right? We have a lot of stored fat that we can always break down so that we can maintain blood sugar. The amount of vitamins and minerals that we have available in our body, if those are low, that can also trigger hunger. So again, the hunger center in the hypothalamus is sensitive to having not enough nutrients in your body. Next, I want to talk about stress. Stress is one of those things where different people can react in different ways. And if you think about an acute stress, like a short-term, very intense stress, like you have to sprint somewhere or you just have a wave of anxiety, that is an acute stress. That often will inhibit appetite because it will stimulate the production of stimulants like adrenaline, and stimulants tend to decrease your appetite. But if you have kind of chronic, long-lasting stress, that will trigger cortisol. And cortisol is that stress hormone that can make you want to eat more food. And this means that your body thinks that it's preparing for a stress where it needs to have extra nutrients. And so it will make you hungry to try to make you store nutrients for this impending doom that might happen. Okay, so when you have lots of long chronic stress, that can make you overeat. Next, we talked about serotonin, how serotonin regulates your digestive process and your mood. Serotonin also plays a role in decreasing your appetite because it's produced when you're starting to absorb nutrients, and then it helps to make you feel full and content. Cholecystokinin, the hormone we just talked about that makes the gallbladder release bile. When you eat fat, you have to digest the fat. Cholecystokinin also sends a signal to your hypothalamus and tells you that you feel full. So cholecystokinin, once you start digesting fat and your gallbladder has contracted, it takes maybe 10 to 15 minutes for that signal to reach your hypothalamus for you to start feeling like, okay, I'm done eating this meal. If you eat slower, you will tend to eat less because that signal, there's a gap, there's a lag time from the time that you're actually technically physically full to when that cholecystokinin hormone reaches your brain. So if you eat slower, you tend to get that signal and make you feel full, and then you don't eat as much. If you eat really, really fast, you're going to eat more than you need to. Last two hormones that play an important role in appetite. Number one is ghrelin. Ghrelin is made by endocrine cells in the stomach, and ghrelin is produced when your stomach is empty for a period of time. Now, your stomach can be empty for a period of time, and you don't have to panic. We have lots of stored energy, so we don't have to eat all the time. But in combination with a cephalic response, if it's circadian rhythm, if it's a time of day that you would normally eat, or if you've, seen a delicious looking commercial of some kind, then you can trigger ghrelin production. And just think of ghrelin makes your stomach growl. And this tells your brain that you're hungry. And the last hormone is called leptin. This is a hormone that is produced by the fat cells. So this is way after the whole digestive process. This is when nutrients have absorbed into the blood. They've gone to the liver. Now the liver has packaged these fats into LDLs that will transport and go to the adipose tissue, which is where we store fat. So this process takes a period of time, maybe even 2 to 3 hours after you eat a meal. Then when fat starts being stored in your fat cells, those fat cells are going to make leptin. And then leptin is going to signal the hypothalamus and say, I'm not hungry. So cholecystokinin is the rapid satiety response, and leptin is the longer lasting response. Now, what people always ask, if leptin is so good at telling the hypothalamus that we're full and we don't want to eat, why don't we just make drugs where we take leptin and then just tell the hypothalamus that we're full all the time, right? Problem solved. It doesn't work that way, unfortunately. So what happens is hormones always have to bind to a receptor. So if this is a hormone and this is the receptor, right? The hormone can't act until it binds to a receptor, then it triggers signaling pathways in the cells. Those receptors will adapt, just like insulin resistance. We've talked about that in other videos. There's a link below if you're curious. Insulin resistance and leptin resistance work in the same way. If you have too much leptin all the time, whether you took a drug of leptin or whether you just eat all the time, and you make a lot of leptin all the time, eventually those receptors will downregulate, meaning the leptin has nowhere to bind. So then it stops making you feel full. One way that you can actually get rid of or reduce leptin resistance is intermittent fasting. You can have periods of time when you're not eating. Then those receptors will come back.